Like with any budget, the first thing to understand with a water budget are the inputs of water to ecosystems. The authors state that precipitation is the major water input to most terrestrial ecosystems. So if we take a look at our model again that they have of a standard terrestrial ecosystem, that precipitation is the primary means by which water enters ecosystems. Now, there's actually two other ways that water can enter into an ecosystem, or if we draw a box around an area, the way that water can be acquired by plants, besides just rain falling and then hitting the soil surface. The first is groundwater. And essentially when we think about groundwater, we tend to think that the rain falls and then it seeps down to a relatively low layer and it sits there. But there also could be lateral movement of groundwater from higher areas, for example. So if you're next to a hilly region, for example, or a very sandy region that is just higher in elevation quite often, that rain will fall and you'll get streams that'll come off of there. But there's often a lot of percolation that happens too. And then that water that's in the soil or enters into the groundwater can move laterally downhill, for example. And that lateral movement is a movement of water into ecosystems or a given unit of land. Once it gets into the groundwater for a given patch of land, it's usually pretty deep and it's often below the rooting systems of most plants. But there are plants that have very deep roots, and these are called Freeoutfights. And Freeoutfights are plants that might not be that tall on the soil surface, but they have very deep roots. And sometimes these roots can go in excess of 50 meters in some cases, but deep enough to tap those deep reservoirs of water. Some example of Freeoutfights, one of them is tamarix, and you can see that it's adjacent in this picture here to a relatively wet area, but it's up on a sandy ridge. But the roots of tamarix go very deep and are able to tap in to the groundwater, which might be on the soil surface here, but be 5-10 meters below the top of this sandy ridge. Another classic example of a Freeoutphyte is a date palm, and these are typical of areas that we think of like oases in the desert systems. But below, you can see it's a relatively dry area, but they still have green fronds in this case, and the roots are going to go relatively deep. And if I remember right, it's somewhere on the order of 10 meters or more below the soil surface, and they're tapping in to groundwater. Now, groundwater is not the only additional source of water that can be tapped. There's also canopy interception. And so on a sunny day, for example, there's no additional water inputs from a tree like this. But if it's cloudy or foggy, that the surface of the leaves are able to capture water, and then it's going to drip down and wet the area below the canopy. So with precipitation coming down, often the canopy will absorb water or intercept water and hold on to it, and this water might not actually make it to the soil surface, but in some cases when you have fog, that fog can condense on the leaves themselves and then later drip down and wet the soil. So canopy interception can be thought of as a different way to input water into ecosystems. And it all has to do with little droplets of water forming on leaves and then eventually rolling off. And in some cases, somewhere on the order of 40%, and in some ecosystems actually 100% of all the water that enters into that ecosystem, or at least hits the soil, comes from canopy interception of fog.